I'm Adelaide Sutphin. I'm a senior. I will be attending Smith College in the fall, where I'll likely be studying government and theater. And I've only been at Hewitt for the past 3 years. So in my junior year, I did my extended inquiry on this topic, which is epic harlots of literary history, Helen of Troy, Daisy Buchanan, and Curley's wife. So to give you a little insight about how I came to my topic, ever since I was a little kid, I was very much a Greek mythology nerd, and I always loved the story of the Trojan War, and I found particular characters in that really interesting, especially Cassandra and Helen of Troy. So I started my project in my junior year, knowing that I'd probably want to research one of these characters. And so the first text I actually read was Trojan Women, which is a play by Euripides from 415 BCE. And the version I read was translated by Alan Shapiro and Diane Sfarlinson. And from this text, I started to get insight into these different characters. I then went on to read the Iliad, where I started to have this focus on Helen of Troy. And the version I read was translated by Richard Lattimore. And from there, I did not go into this project thinking I would be connecting it to the Great Gatsby and Of Mice and Men. That came about fairly later on in the process, which Dr. Brennan was my EI advisor and knows that it was a little hectic, but once I found that connection, it was very clear to me how these women were connected. So getting into that a little bit, that led me to my research question, which was how is the story of Helen of Troy echoed in the Great Gatsby and Of Mice and Men? So for a little bit of background information, Helen of Troy in the Iliad is the former queen of Sparta, and it is her marriage to a prince of Troy that begins the kind of Trojan War. And Daisy Buchanan is the love interest in the Great Gatsby, and Curley's wife is the wife of the ranch owner's son in Of Mice and Men, and is this character that comes about a lot in terms of being the only woman on this ranch. So the thesis that I eventually came to was that Helen, Daisy, and Curley's wife are similar in their treatment and reception, both within and outside of the novels they are featured in. So to give you a little more view into what I did in terms of my research on Helen of Troy, I looked at, so the Iliad has been around for 2,000 plus years. So what I was really looking at was how this character had kind of come down to us through the years and all of these different adaptations of her and kind of views of her that exist. So up here I have 4 of those views. So the painting all the way over there is Evelyn de Morgan's 1898 painting of Helen. The painting that is a little further up is Jacopo Tintoretto's 1579 painting of her. And then the 2 texts that are on the bottom are 2 very critical perceptions of Hewitt, of Helen. One is Giovanni Boccaccio's famous Women, which is from 1362, and the other is Alexander Ross's Mystagoras Poeticus, which is from 1647. So you can get kind of from this alone that there is this very kind of existing conflict over whether or not Helen is guilty in kind of the scope of the Trojan War and how much she is actually to blame for what happens. There are 2 portrayals up there that kind of view her as a victim and kind of more innocent, and there are 2 that blame her completely for the events that followed. So kind of moving into the history aspect of my project, when I was looking at both Daisy and Curley's wife, I was looking at this idea of what the ideal women or like what being a woman meant in the 1920s and 30s. So in the 20s, a lot of us, I think, associate the 1920s and women with the idea of the flapper, which is a great example of what this idea of the new woman was. And in a lot of ways, Fitzgerald creates Daisy as this character who both represents the new woman and many believe represents his own views of the new woman, which are quite negative. In the 1920s, there was this kind of push for women to have this sexual freedom and kind of this split from motherhood that hadn't necessarily existed in the past. And as that came about, Daisy is this character who's married and who also has an affair. So she is kind of this critique of the new woman. And then for the 1930s, for Curley's wife, the Great Depression kind of reversed a lot of that change that was happening around the idea of kind of what it meant to be a woman, and it kind of pushed women back into the household, where Curley's wife is also kind of this antithesis to that idea in that she's in the household and she's married, but she doesn't have kids, and she's often referred to as this kind of tart. So that leads me into what my three main kind of focuses were of the comparisons between these women, which were in their physical allure, their objectification, and their villainization. So all three of these women are constantly referred to as being beautiful, but that beauty is never specifically described for any of them. The furthest you will get is potentially a little bit about the color of their hair or how their voice sounds and the fact that they are all white women. Other than that, their beauty is completely in the eye of the beholder. So it kind of leaves them open to constantly being objectified, which was the main second point of my research. All three of these women are constantly objectified, both within the texts and eventually outside of them. Helen is referred to throughout the Iliad as kind of this property or this piece of property that can be won through war, who's going to be traded back and forth. Daisy is seen as the object of Gatsby's desires, and Curley's wife is objectified as this kind of slut figure. And that leads into the third kind of point of comparison, which was how these women have all been villainized. And that was really the focus of my research this year. So kind of moving into that, the relevance of this, these women have been villainized a lot, especially in the kind of critical reception of them. And these are texts that are very commonly taught in the US and at Hewitt, which is really what I wanted to focus on this year. So my research this year was Helen's at Hewitt, exploring the role of Daisy Buchanan and Curley's wife in Hewitt classrooms. So for my research this year, I was looking at the question of how are Daisy Buchanan and Curley's wife being taught and received by Hewitt students. So I shifted a little bit away from Helen because I knew that the Great Gatsby and Of Mice and Men were actively being taught at Hewitt. So I interviewed 3 Hewitt teachers and 3 Hewitt students who have engaged with these texts in the classroom. And as I was doing my interviews, I kind of came to these 3 main codes, which are themes. So when you're doing an interview afterwards, you kind of code all of your interviews based on like finding these central themes that pop up. And these were the big 3 for me. So those were teaching styles, identity and power, and this potential idea of Hewitt idealization. So in terms of teaching styles, going back to that idea of villainization of these women, every teacher I talked to pushed their students to look beyond the surface and actually consider why these women were doing what they were doing and not just take them for kind of the continued idea that's been created of them. And that kind of led into identity and power. A lot of these teachers were pushing their students to look at, okay, this is a woman in the 1920s, in the 1930s. What's the context of her life? How much power does she have? How does she use that power? And how might that impact her actions and then how we view her? And finally, there was this idea of Hewitt idealization. So what's actually interesting is this kind of exact quote that I looked at came up earlier in what Dr. Brennan and Leo were saying, where there's this question of, is Hewitt's push to kind of create this idea of a very strong and powerful woman, are we potentially forgetting about these stories of those women who can't be strong or can't be powerful because of the structures that exist around them? So that was a question that was raised both by teachers and students that I interviewed, and I think it's something that's really important to kind of continue to consider. So going into the importance of this, again, these are texts that are very relevant in the American education system and are also very relevant at Hewitt. So kind of understanding and pushing for this sympathy for these women, or at least this attempt to understand them. You don't have to like them, but kind of trying to understand why they're doing what they're doing can kind of open students to kind of being more understanding in general. So to kind of close out, I wanted to share with you a quote from one of my interviews, which was by a teacher at Hewitt, where she said that as educators, we don't teach them what to think, but how to think, and you can always go deeper. And that's the beautiful thing to me teaching English. You always have a text that wherever they're at, you can go a little bit deeper than where they start. You're making that foundation firmer for them because they're not afraid of ideas, because they can see how nuanced they are. There is no all right, all wrong. Everything is here in this little space. Everything's in this middle space. These women exist in this middle space. Many of us do. But pushing Hewitt students to think about these characters as people and not just as this example of this is good and this is evil, but rather to focus on why people do what they do is something that's incredibly important and is currently existing at Hewitt. Thank you so much.